Welcome to Forging Resilience, exploring for a different perspective on strength and leadership. Join me as we discuss experiences and stories with guests to help gain fresh insights around challenge, success, and leadership. Today on Forging Resilience, I have the pleasure of sitting in front of Oli France, an international adventurer, keynote speaker, founder of The Wild Edge, which is a company that guides teams through the world's wildest places. Oli, welcome to the show, mate.
A big thanks for having me. Really looking forward to this conversation.
No, likewise, mate. Before we dive into who you are and what you get up to, I think as a father of two young kids who's constantly dragging them out on adventures, it sounds like you've got the ultimate job, mate. And I've seen some of those videos and experiences. How do you get into adventuring as a career, mate? Good on you.
Yeah, well, thank you. And it's not something you're going to get told about in the careers office in school, is it?
No.
But for me, it was, I grew up in a northern town, in northern England, fairly ordinary background, playing lots of sports, rugby league and football. And it was at the age of 17, I went rock climbing for the first time. And having spent my childhood looking out the window, wanting to be outside, being told no a lot, now I'm being told, go and climb up this dangerous rock face. And there was just something really exciting about that very, very quickly. Off the back of that one experience at the age of 17, I decided to sign up to this outdoor leadership degree course. That was kind of my pathway in. And I think the biggest thing there is now I'm in this environment, and I think it's this thing of environmental change. I'm in this environment surrounded by peers, surrounded by leaders, surrounded by teachers and mentors. I'm learning about this world of adventure, exploration, travel, and of course the practical things behind that, how to plan an expedition, how to fundraise, how to lead teams, how to navigate bureaucracies, all of these things from quite a young age. And so that was that set the scene for my career. And each year that went by, and that's 15 years ago now that I started that career, I've just found myself on a journey going deeper and deeper into this world of adventure, pushing boundaries and taking it as far as I possibly can.
I love that, mate. So let's go straight in then. So what does deeper into adventure mean to you?
Yeah, so I think adventure, it's interesting this because so often we hear in this world of adventure, let's go and conquer or people go and conquer mountains. For me, that never resonates. I don't think mountains are there to be conquered. And in a sense, it's an inward journey as much as it is an outward journey. And I often say that if we conquer anything, it's something within ourselves. And so much of it has been about self-exploration as well as physical exploration of the world. And in a sense, it's also been pushing my boundaries in terms of the expeditions that I'm taking on. Taking on things which are more and more logistically complex, more physically difficult, emotionally difficult, and I suppose taking things to the absolute limit of what I think is possible in my own unique way.
Yeah, I love that, mate. So I guess to crudely put it is that it's being in an environment that tests your mindset, and there's also a logistical and a logical element to that as well. Bearing that in mind, that the mindset to logistics, do you have to go sometimes to extreme environments to be able to tap into those things to learn about yourself, or can you find adventure closer to home?
I think you can find adventure close to home, absolutely. And I think adventure is a very personal thing to everybody. Everybody's got their own relationship to adventure. So what is a huge adventure to one person could be very easy to another or completely terrifying to another. And so we've also all got this personal dynamic, and it also evolves over time. So certainly, as I look back to my early years, the Lake District, North Wales, Scotland, these were my training grounds. And, I will even to this day say you can face some of the harshest conditions on planet Earth in Scotland on the Cairngorm Plateau, for instance, in the middle of winter. And so certainly adventure can be found closer to home. But I think through that evolution, as we learn and evolve and stretch our own boundaries, inevitably, if we want to continue delving deeper, going into new unknowns, that then involves going out to remoter, more hostile, more wild places, for me at least. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with staying in that comfort zone and going on different trajectories, but that's just the itch that I've had through the years that's driven me.
What might be one of the one or two biggest things that you've learned about yourself in terms of self-exploration, regardless of where it was or the physical challenge or extreme environment, Oli?
Yeah, good question. I think one thing that I've learned is regarding intensity in a sense. And if you were to ask this question of my close friends and family, they will probably say, I like a fairly high level of intensity. I don't rest and relax well. I imagine a lot of your guests will be similar on that kind of spectrum of intensity. And so I feel at my best in high intensity environments when my mind is being challenged to problem solve and to make decisions and to try and move forward. So, but I think, one of the great lessons, which I think is related to that I was given from a young age, I met this French mountain guide, and he was giving us some skills on alpinism, and we were out in the French Alps crossing these technical ridges. And one thing he talked about was trying to be like a metronome. So a metronome is this device which is constantly going click, click, click. It's perpetual motion. It's constant. It's consistent. And he talked about operating in this way, like a metronome, with this perpetual motion. And that's kind of always stuck with me. And so, yes, that can slow, that can speed up. But I'm always trying to look forward. I'm always trying to think multiple steps ahead. I think that's also a consequence of leading expeditions, where now you've got 10 or 15 people under your watch. You're taking them doing something highly uncomfortable, highly uncertain for them. That then introduces many, many more variables to think about. And so you've got to be planning ahead, thinking ahead, and really tapping into that internal metronome. So I think that's one feature in my mind that I've discovered and thought about a lot over the last 15 years.
So what I'm hearing then, if I understand this rightly, is that metronome to you is that continuous gentle stepping forward rather than stopping. It's one small action, it's another small action, and in certain cases it's quite a few ahead because of the responsibility of leading people, and that's the way your mind works. Have I heard that right?
Yes, and I think there's a misconception. I mean, to go further into this, I think there's generally a misconception that to make changes in our life requires huge leaps of faith. Big steps into the unknown. Maybe occasionally that's necessary. But what I have found, and I think this idea or this principle of the metronome, is that actually it's those steady, consistent, disciplined, small incremental steps that are far more meaningful and effective for long-term change and long-term steps towards success. And so that's what I've tried. I think it's summarized perfectly by expeditions, because you're doing thousands and thousands of steps. You're covering huge distances over multiple weeks and months sometimes. And so that analogy, I think, really rings true.
How do you manage to stay ahead of that curve then when you're leading people and all their own expectations, challenges, and the environment, plus yourself? And how do you manage to stay ahead of the curve or to the rhythm of the metronome?
Yeah, well, this is something I've thought about a lot. And in a sense, I've had to develop a bit of a strategy to make sure I can stay ahead. And I'm always thinking, so, first of all, that comes long before the expedition even begins. And the first step to that for me is building my awareness of what it is we're going to go and do. So building that real deep knowledge and understanding of what we're trying to do. What are the many ways in which we could fail? I almost try and become a student of failure. This is how I look at it. So if I'm going climbing a particular mountain, I'll go as far as researching all the accidents and even fatalities that have happened there. Where are the accident hotspots? Why have things gone wrong? What can I do to avoid that? So that's building the background knowledge, having then plans built around that. Just from a practical sense, contingency plans, plan Bs, evacuation plans, medical plans, etc. And then it's when you're actually there in the thick of it, on leading an expedition, it's keeping those things in mind. And I think, certainly somebody from your own background, you'll probably have an appreciation of this, is having this almost sensitivity of what's happening right now around you, almost a hypersensitivity and alertness. Thinking about the consequences of your actions, and what they could be, positive or negative. What are the consequences of any given decision? And I think that the final piece there is having adaptability built into your plans. These are complex logistical expeditions that we're taking on sometimes. Yes, you can plan. Yes, you can think about everything. But when you're there, sometimes the most unpredictable things happen. And that's where having a final element of adaptability. So I think, to summarize that, it's having awareness, having anticipation for the things that could go wrong, and then having adaptability to evolve plans in real time.
Love that. Cheers, mate. Could you give us an example or something that sticks out in your mind of a time where you've done all the things that you need to do in terms of having the awareness, you put the plans in, and you've got the adaptability, or a time where you have had to adapt to a situation?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there are many, but one that stands out, which I put a lot of time into, and this was a very ambitious project. This was back in 2018. I was going out to northern Iraq for the first time, leading a group. And over the course of the next few years, I wanted to develop a really ambitious expedition to northern Iraq in Kurdish region. You've got very big snowy mountains on the Iranian border. I wanted to go and organize and lead an expedition to the highest mountain in Iraq. This is not something that people normally do. You've got minefields there, you've got militia groups, it's near the sensitive border area. So there's lots of things that could go wrong. So I went and recce'd it on my own. So I thought, if I'm going to take a group out there, I need to have a great awareness and understanding of everything involved. So went out there, built some local contacts, essentially established contact with the best mountain guide in the country, went and recce'd the route, even obtained some old Russian maps which had documented the minefields on the mountain. You could navigate around those, climbed the mountain, success, and figured out, what it takes to make this expedition possible. Marketed the trip. A year later, returned with a team. Now, 18 months has gone into this whole project. Got a team together. They paid money to be there, trusting me to deliver on this expedition, and everything. Yeah, I felt like everything was covered from a risk perspective, from a communications emergency perspective. But there was one thing which was beyond my control, which is the final slope up towards the summit. And that, because of my, I suppose, training in understanding avalanche risks, I knew that was a potential avalanche risk because of the angle of the slope, the elevation of the slope, the curvature of the slope, etc. And that was the only route up the summit. So if the snow conditions weren't favorable, I knew that all of this work could have gone towards ultimately not being able to succeed. And we got up there. We've been trekking for several days, fully self-supported, carrying heavy loads through deep snow. We're the only people on the mountain. This is pure adventure. And we get up there at last after 4 or 5 days and hit the final slope. All the way along, I've been testing the snow. I've been building avalanche pits. I've been describing to the team what it is that I was doing, almost bringing them into my decision making so that they had a deeper understanding of what's going through my mind. And then we get up to the final slope. I'm already thinking the conditions aren't ideal, because what you had essentially was, in the layers of the snow on the top, you had this wind slab, which is really hard, almost like granite would be the analogy. And then below that, you had something called graupel, which is like little ball bearings. So it's like granite on top of ball bearings, and that just splits and shears off in huge masses of snow and ice, even in isolated areas. And this extended way up the slope. So it's an absolute recipe for disaster. But of course, on the other part of my mind, or what could have influenced my decision making in a negative way, is all of these people have flown out halfway around the world to be there. They've paid good money. They've trusted me to get them to the top. And there's this expectation that we'll be able to summit, but I know that it will be dangerous to do so. And so ultimately we did have to adapt, and I had to make that decision to turn back. And, having reflected on it over the last few years and spoken to other guides, and I'm absolutely certain that it was the right decision. And so we had to bail off the mountain, and we couldn't succeed with summiting. But from a long-term perspective, I built great relationships with that team. They've joined me on future expeditions. In short term, I went to a contingency plan, and we went and explored another area of the mountains, and still had an amazing trip. But that was a time where I had to adapt, and these are big decisions, really, because if I'd have made the wrong call there, the situation could have been very, very grave for all of us.
Yeah, no, I bet. So do you have a rough framework that you go to then for making decisions under pressure in tough environments? Because I can hear the weight of, I don't know if balancing is the right word, but I'll use it. There's no right or wrong here, but yeah, keeping in consideration that the pressure to keep this group alive, but also their probably anticipation and need and desire to get to the top. So is there certain things that you can do, or that you talk about or teach, especially given your talks, in terms of making tough decisions?
Yeah, so the first thing that comes to mind is something which I try and put across to all of the teams I work with, particularly on expeditions, also in talks, and I've guided people from all walks of life, some of them very, very successful, even billionaires, CEOs, industry-leading business figures, ex-CIA officers, worked with special forces. And one of the things I'll say before we even step foot on the mountain is to leave the egos behind. So it doesn't matter to me who's sat in front of me. I will say that because once you're up against the forces of Mother Nature in a mountain environment, the human ego is powerless against avalanches, earthquakes, rockfalls, you name it, any matter of things that can happen. So I try and separate this sense of ego and, in a way, emotion from decision making on the mountain. The other thing I'll do is I'll have our priorities straight right from the start. And one of the things I make crystal clear is that priority number one on any expedition is getting everyone home safely. Priority number two is summiting the mountain, which people often get the wrong way around. And that's when you hear of, this thing of summit fever, where people are so invested in it and they've spent all this money and they go onto the summit to their own demise often. So that having that framework of, okay, the number one priority is our safety, that then filters down through every decision. So when it comes to those critical decisions, I'm coming back to this framework. And I think the final thing that I use in the heat of the moment is when I'm making a big decision, I think about the fact that every decision has got you've got to consider the past, present, and future. This is what I'm thinking. So past is that background knowledge, all of that planning, everything about the area where you are. Present is what mood is your team in right now? What's the morale? What's the level of energy? And then thinking about the future, what are the consequences, good or bad, depending on your decisions? So, and this is a one-time thing. This is a continuous sort of monitoring of these factors to make good, informed decisions, which aren't based on ego and emotion, but are based on logic and reason, to make decisions which meet the ultimate goal of your own safety, so you can have a lifetime of adventures.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's really interesting. And I guess what you've said there as well is that you're constantly running through that yourself, because it goes back to that almost like trying to fail. So you were running through those constant things of, separation from the emotion, knowing where your priorities are, and thinking past, present, and future before you even stepped on the mountain, so that it's not so long to take the decision.
Absolutely. Yeah. Even to the point where I will think about these key areas in my mind of, I know this is going to be a decision point on the mountain. It might be a dangerous ridge. It might be an avalanche risk on a particular slope. And, through visualization almost, I'm thinking about what I will be doing in that situation, so that when I'm actually there in the moment, it somehow feels familiar. I think that's the power of visualization. It's something we hear a lot about now. And it's, it's hard to recreate those moments unless you spend every day of every year in the mountains. But what you can do is mentally rehearse, visualize, make those decisions, think about the rationale behind it. And then in the moment, you're much more able to make the big calls.
You talk about risk management. You gave a talk on that at TEDx Bristol about risk management. What's maybe some of the surprising things that you've learned about risk management, or that people hear when you talk about risk management, mate?
Yeah, I mean, my talk was almost initially a counterintuitive view of risk, which is the thing that we often don't consider, is the risk of not taking action. And what the other way you could describe that is the opportunity cost. And so often, I think we fret and we worry about what's going to happen if we make big decisions and bold life changes. But the thing we don't consider is the risk of carrying on as we are and the opportunities we could be missing out on. So I think that's kind of the counter view of risk that I think about. What else is it that about risk that I think people miss? I think ultimately navigating risk is about making decisions. And when I think about all of the high performers that I've worked with over the years, successful people from all walks of life, one trait that I've really noticed, which I think filters down to this idea of risk, is they're very fast at making decisions. They don't wait around. They commit to a decision. And I think so often what I've seen in business world in particular is that there's a fear of making big decisions, and there are endless meetings and there's procrastination, and they're fearful of these imaginary risks, or that they spend so long dwelling on these potential problems that nobody makes a decision, and they're not moving forward. Making a decision, even when you're not presented with any good options, at least that's forward momentum. You can see if that's going to work and actually commit to it. So, does that relate to risk? I think so, because ultimately navigating risk is all about making those good proactive decisions.
Yeah. The sort of insights that you're talking about, mate, do those come to you when you're on the mountains, or do you take a lot of or out and about, or do you take time to reflect and let them bubble up?
Yeah, it's I suppose I've been so immersed in this world of expeditions now for the last 15 years, and there are some really intense periods where I might be doing 12 to 15 expeditions a year, and I'd be going to Syria one month, I'd be going to Somalia the next, and so I've found myself for long periods really immersed in this world where I am having to lead, I'm having to make these decisions, I'm having to think about risk, I'm having to develop strategies to almost make my life easier as well. When we're working, we're doing sort of actual work on a laptop, say, we try and figure out systems and processes to make our lives easier. In a sense, I've had to do the same thing to make my life easier doing my job. So, yeah, it's been a gradual, iterative process. Sometimes you have a spark of an idea and you remember it. And of course, learning from others. I've had the opportunity to work with all kinds of individuals from all kinds of backgrounds. And I've kind of cherry picked things that I've liked from different worlds and tried to bring that into what I do as well.
You touched on something there about being a good leader, of which you are. But what in your mind makes a good leader, and who do you look up to or looked up to as a bit of a mentor or a guide to learn and copy from?
I think, first of all, the leader needs to have a very clear vision of what they're trying to achieve and be able to really bring people on board with that vision quite easily. And through whether that's through storytelling, whether that's through their actions, they need, because ultimately leadership is about taking a team from point A to point B, isn't it? Whatever it is you're trying to achieve. And so the leader's got to galvanize that team and get them to see the light at the end of the tunnel, get them to see that vision and focus on it and have that as the absolute driving force. So a focus on vision, I think, is important. I think the other important thing is really understanding what's motivating the individuals in your team and not seeing them as kind of cogs in a machine, but human beings, which they are, who each have their own lives, their own fears, their own doubts, their own hopes, dreams, loved ones, etc., who all have their own deep burning desire, which is probably different amongst each of them, each person. And I think what I always try and do is really get a good understanding of what it is that's really motivating somebody to be there, taking on whatever it is we're trying to achieve. Because I think the reason that's so important is when you're going through something really hard together, tapping into that deep internal motivator is far more powerful. To give you an example of that, I've had people climbing mountains with me. They've lost a parent recently or something. They've lost a loved one, and they're doing it for them. And you can bet if you're a few hundred meters from the summit and they're suffering like never before in their life, but you remind them of what it is they're doing it for, that will energize them and get them onto the summit. Now, what I say to one person might be different to what I say to another. But if I don't really deeply understand what's motivating people, it's going to be, very, very difficult.
Yeah. Oli, who's somebody you've looked up to then as a leader and been able to emulate on your career and journey, mate?
Yeah, good question. I mean, one was I talked about playing a lot of sport when I was younger, and this definitely had a lasting impact on me. And we had, for context, we had a very, very good rugby league team at school. We were reaching the national final, playing at the Millennium Stadium, and throughout my sort of school years, formative years, really, I'm playing sport 5 or 6 times a week, competitive sport. 90% of the time we're winning. I happen to be part of really good teams with really good coaches. And so I think I was fortunate to have this very clear idea of what high performance means. And I remember certain days we get back from a match and we might have won 3-0 and we're celebrating in the dressing room. And then the manager comes in and he tells us off because it should have been 6 or 7-0. And it's almost from that young age, it's not being complacent. It's always pushing and striving for more and seeing that in a way, the limitations we place on ourselves are constricting, and it's we who can challenge them. So these names probably wouldn't mean anything to you, but Manny, my old football coach, he was an incredible mentor, very, very strong leader, set very high standards of us. There's something called the Pygmalion effect, which is this idea amongst leaders that if you set high expectations amongst your team, they will rise to meet those expectations. I think that's true. I think it's the job of a leader to set those standards. If you communicate to your team often enough that you are a world-class team doing world-class things, they're going to start to believe it. I'm sure that's a tactic used in the special forces, for instance. And it's creating that narrative that people can buy into and latch onto, and that everybody knows that this is the standard that you operate at. Those are the people who inspired me. Another one was Sean Wayne. He was coaching us in rugby for a short time. He's now the head coach at England's rugby and one of the most successful sports coaches in the UK. Very, very fortunate to be coached by him for a young age. Demands high performance and doesn't settle for anything less.
Oh, great. Cheers, mate. And I want to circle back to risk and home. Has your appetite for risk changed over the years as you've matured and as life happens, be that kids or relationships or parents? Yeah, I'm curious to hear that side of it, mate, and how that is panning out for you.
Yeah, absolutely it has. And certainly, any parent out there will know that when you have children, your perception of risk definitely changes. It was the same for me. I think for most people that would be the case. And so that didn't mean, though, that I was going to stop doing hard things and taking on expeditions, because this is my purpose in life. I feel this is my absolute passion, my driving force, the thing that excites me and makes me the best version of myself. So, but what it did do is make me take an even deeper study of the risks that I'm taking, go even further into the planning, make sure that I'm holding myself accountable to the highest possible standards of safety, because anything less than that would be recklessness. And so I feel I cannot afford to be reckless, because it's more than just me now. I've got a family to look after. Certainly, when I look back at my younger years, there was definitely one period I finished university, done a year of traveling, ended up in the corporate world for a couple of years, absolutely hated it to such an extent. I was a shell of myself. I was, unrecognizable from the person I am today, really. You could say, I was close to being depressed, or not that I ever went and saw anyone, but I was in this deep, dark place, and eventually rallied myself, quit the job, and embarked on this big 4-month expedition all the way across Asia on my own in winter. And there were definitely moments there where I was being very reckless. I was taking big risks. And partly, that was because I didn't value my life as much. I wanted the thrill. I wanted that excitement. I didn't really care about the consequences. Now I do care about the consequences, and I think very deeply about mitigating risks as much as possible.
Yeah. How do you then balance that, or how do you get that need for excitement and thrill and still manage to justify that to yourself and probably your partner as well?
Yeah, I think it's funny. I often, people like myself, and again, I'm sure lots of people you've had on this, I've always had this, or for a long time, I've had this sense that for something to be worthwhile, you almost need to suffer. Like it needs to hurt, almost type 2 fun, But actually, I'm seeing more and more that type 1 fun is okay too. We can seek that out, pure sort of untainted fun without the burden of suffering. And so actually, that's something which I'm craving more and more. That's something which I'm doing with my family. And now, I get so much joy from taking my little ones to, up to the Lake District and going paddleboarding or going up a hill or whatever it might be. And so, I've seen that, I definitely encountered a lot of people who've continued with that reckless streak, and they're no longer here because they don't last very long in the world of the mountains. And so I saw that I had to evolve, and now having children, I had to change my mindset. And there was a climber, I forget his name off the top of my head, but he talks about trying to find joy in the valleys as much as the mountains. Which is, I think, a metaphor for life itself. It's easy to find joy in the extremes, isn't it, and the really exciting moments. But to find joys in the ordinary and the everyday, I think that's the ultimate goal, and that's something I'm still striving towards, but getting better at as well.
Yeah, aren't we all? Welcome to the club, mate. For what you're saying there speaks to me about being present, regardless of whether at the top of the mountain or the bottom of the valley. And I guess it goes back to what you're talking about earlier, is your own ability to adapt now that your responsibilities and outlook on life has changed, especially having kids. Mate, I'm going back to your not most recent, because I know you've just come back from Kilimanjaro, which is a pretty cool story as well. But I'm really interested to hear about Death Valley to Denali. Am I pronouncing that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
and the Ultimate 7. Give us a little overview about that, mate, and some of the challenges. In fact, let me just tell you as well, it's one of those things that I've spent a little bit of time away from home, both in the military and when I was working overseas a lot. And it reminded me a tiny bit of that my day to day was very routine. And it would be quite a few days where I didn't see any updates from yourself in your cycling kit, and then suddenly you're wearing waterproofs and it's starting to rain and get colder and colder. And it's just ironic. It reminded me of that time that, you're very different. For here, it was really routine for me, and you were there going through completely different environments and challenges along that journey that you got to do there, mate. But give us a little oversight of Death Valley to Denali and the Ultimate 7 project, mate.
Well, I appreciate that, and appreciate you following along. I enjoyed sort of sharing the story. So this project, I think, to preface it, all throughout these expeditions, I've had this bucket list of kind of ultimate expeditions. And over time, some of them would ebb away and I'd lose interest, or I'd think, it's too dangerous, too risky. But some of them just stuck. And this project was one that always stuck. And whenever I had chance or free time, I would think about it, I'd plan towards it, but never really talk about it. It's not something I share publicly. And so it is, what I'm talking about is something I named the Ultimate 7 project, which is, in my view, the biggest, boldest challenge I could think of, really, that is just about possible, but never been done. And so the idea is 7 separate expeditions on each of the 7 continents. journeying by human power alone from the lowest point in the continent to the highest. Nobody's done that. It's a multi-year project. All 7 have their own logistical complexities. And so I decided eventually 18 months ago to launch this project. Felt quite scary to put that out in the world because then there's a certain accountability. But I think that's a good thing sometimes. And actually through announcing our goals, we can give ourselves a kick up the backside. So I announced it. And then last summer I did the Africa leg, which was successful, challenging in parts, very, very hot. I had some hostility cycling through Ethiopia, but ultimately succeeded. And then this year, I wanted to take on the North America leg, which would always be one of the most challenging, which might surprise people because, you think North America, you think, well, it's Western country, highly developed, good infrastructure, etc. But actually, once you're way up north in northern Canada, Alaska, and into the mountains there, it's extremely wild, extremely inhospitable, very remote, with lots of dangers. And so, to very quickly run you over what that looks like, it's a 3-stage journey from Death Valley in California to Denali in Alaska, 3,500 miles, which is the same distance as London to Dubai, or London to Washington, DC in the opposite direction. The first phase will be a solo cycle from down there in California all the way up to Alaska, fully self-supported, carrying all my own gear. Just at the start of spring, coming into the middle of spring, where it was just on the edge of being possible to pass these mountain roads in the Yukon. Once I reached the base of the mountain, 99% of teams fly directly into Denali Base Camp via ski plane. For us to do it human-powered, with this small team that I'd assembled, we needed to basically ski into base camp, which nobody does. My best source of information was 20 years ago. And that involved an 8-day ski, carrying all of our gear in heavy packs and sleds, crossing rivers in bare country, traversing crevasses, avalanches coming down near us, small foothills, just to reach base camp. We didn't see any of the humans. And at the end of that, then you've got to climb the mountain, which is colder, windier, stormier than Everest. Last year, of all the people who attempted it, only 30% had succeeded. And so overall, looking at this whole project, many people have tried it, but nobody in 25 years has succeeded with what I was trying to take on. And so the logistical complexities of pulling up this all together in a narrow time frame, pushing hard every single day with many risks along the way, lots of uncertainty, would be, very, very, very challenging. And so that's the background for the project.
Yeah, it's an incredible achievement, mate. It was, it's hard to comprehend, despite the videos, despite the reports and the photos. But it's incredible, mate. It's very, very inspiring.
Thank you.
I'm curious to know where your mind goes, especially on the bike leg, on those long straight roads, where maybe it's not that risky in terms of. Well, the only real risk I think you're talking about is potentially the drivers. But where does your mind go when you start to suffer there and you're not having to constantly calculate risk?
Yeah, it's interesting. And in a sense, I often say that on these solo expeditions, you can travel halfway around the world, but you end up spending most of your time in your own head.
Love that, mate. That's brilliant.
Yeah, which was exactly the same for me. And, it seems bizarre to say it, but you can, even on your own, and I was having 1, maybe 2 human interactions a day, and I'm sat on the bike for 8, 10, 12 hours a day. So that's a long time in your own head. And you can experience every emotion. I was experiencing every emotion on that, which might sound surprising, but you can have, absolute pits of misery and questioning every decision you've ever made, their life choices, essentially, in a deep, dark place, knowing it's weeks to see family again, absolutely suffering physically, ligaments on my body are swollen and heart struggling to walk. Don't even get me started on my backside, and so you go from these lows, but then also you do get these massive highs, and you get these great, you hit the top of a mountain pass in the Yukon, and you've got bison and moose and grizzlies and wolf prints and amazing mountains in every direction.
Well, just while you're there, what's the emotion that comes to you when you describe that, mate?
Absolute freedom and absolute joy, and the pinnacle of why we do adventure. Yeah,
Love
yeah.
it.
Euphoria, I suppose you could say, without the need for drugs or anything.
Yeah, yeah. Which I
Yeah,
guess again for me, I seeing it through my lens is being present to what's around
yeah,
us, recognizing the beauty, the danger, the hostility, the vulnerability, whatever word you want to throw in there. But yeah,
yeah. And I think the other part of it is it's definitely present, but it's also a sense of having worked for it. I
okay, yeah,
think
great.
that the physical struggle, and I think without if we get things too easily, do we value them? Not really. If we've had to really work for something, really push ourselves to the limits, and then eventually we succeed and we get that view, we get to the summit, whatever it is, then it's a much deeper euphoria, satisfaction.
Yeah, I love that. Doing the work. Yeah, completely agree. What might next? What's the next trip in terms of the Ultimate Seven, mate, in that project from lowest to highest?
Yeah, so the next one is South America. So now just about 3 months away from that. So that's going to be a 1,600-mile cycle through Argentina, starting near Patagonia, and then ultimately finishing up on the Chilean border with a big mountain called Aconcagua, which is 6,900 meters. So it's a big, windy mountain. It's not as technically difficult as Denali, but still with its elevation, remoteness, winds, etc., it will be a real challenge. But yeah, that's going to be January. Really excited for that one.
Nice one, mate. What might be on your bucket list that you'd be happy to share with us, Ollie, given that you don't often?
Yeah, well, definitely, the big focus is the Ultimate Seven. That there's still several years left of that. We've got the South America leg. But beyond that, you got some huge challenges. The Asia leg is Dead Sea to Everest. So that is essentially, you're going 4,500 miles right the way across Asia, through 9 different countries, some pretty tricky places as well from a security point of view. You've got the Antarctica leg, very, very complex, more expensive, cold, challenging. And the Oceania leg, which is kind of, everybody forgets about that. But that's going to be very logistically complex, and it'll involve some water crossings as well. And so that's kind of the immediate focus for the coming years. I think beyond that, certainly one thing I have dedicated myself to is traveling as much as possible. I'd love to see as many countries around the world as I possibly can, and not just go and tick them off, but have real experiences there. And so, yeah, I'm up to about 75 countries or so. Still a long way to go, but that's somewhere down the bucket list. I'd love to visit every country on earth if I can make that
Brilliant.
happen.
Still time. You're only a whippersnapper, mate. I can see that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it might be all that fresh air. I don't know, but
Yeah.
what's a downside to you, mate, not being able to get out and experience the thrill of adventure or that sort of euphoria? What's the price you and your loved ones have to live with?
Yeah, well, it does. I think anything ultimately involves sacrifice. Anything in life, with every decision, there's going to be a sacrifice. And whether that's doing an ordinary day job, that will come with sacrifice as well. But for me, it is time away from family. And that is challenging for me and definitely my wife and wider family, who then have to pull together. And so that's difficult to navigate. But certainly since having children, I've really taken conscious steps to focus on real big projects. And, strange as it sounds to say it, this is my career. I've built this career in this world of adventure and expeditions. And so I want to excel at my career. I want to do a good job. I want to try and build and grow. And I also know that I am the best version of myself. Having spent time in that corporate world and been in this deep, deep, dark pit, I know that I'm my best version of myself when I'm like this. And yes, I'm away, but the beauty of what I do is when I get home for a few months at a time, I can be really present. I can enjoy those ordinary things. And it's the ordinary things I crave, actually. It's going to the park with my kids. It's, having picnics. It's all those things that I crave.
Brilliant, mate. Ollie, listen, I've thoroughly enjoyed speaking to you today, mate. And before we wrap up, is there anything you want to mention or you feel like you'd like to talk about before we start to finish?
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's been a great conversation. I think Yeah, first of all, please do come and follow along. You know, this is just the beginning of a multi-year project, which is only going to get bigger, bolder, more challenging. And, you know, maybe because I'm not too interested in talking more about myself, but I think one thing I always like to mention is you talked about who inspires me. So maybe a nice way to wrap up would be sharing a very quick story of a guy who's one of the most inspirational people I've met, who I've learned a lot from. And we talked about being present. Well, this was an 85-year-old guy who I took on an expedition on a trip to Iraq. That was less of a technical, difficult expedition, but I took him to Iraq. He wanted to visit every country. He was 85. He had terminal cancer. He had a pacemaker in his heart. He had a stoma in his stomach and months to live. And he was selling off his life possessions to visit the last remaining countries in the world. And everything on paper says this should be the most miserable guy on planet Earth. But he was by far the happiest, by far the happiest. He was living and breathing every moment, every single second. And I spent a week in this guy's company, and that served as a huge reminder to me that we only get one go at this thing called life. So why not grab hold of it, seize every second like this guy was doing, and really go for those big goals and big dreams, because nobody else is going to do it for us. So, hey, maybe we'll wrap up with that little inspirational story.
Yeah, no, that sounds absolutely perfect, mate. And what a way to end our chat, mate. Well, again, thanks for making the time and effort to speak to me today, mate. Keep on doing what you're doing. I love your thought-provoking work and the way that you managed to describe and talk about it. So, yeah, thanks, Oli. I'll put the links to you in the show notes, and I'll look forward to watching and learning from your next expedition and adventure, buddy.
Awesome. Top man, Aaron. Really appreciate your time and the interview, and let's keep in touch, buddy.
Definitely. Cheers, pal.
Top man.